All right. Hey, what's up, guys? To jump right into it, we have a fair bit of business and other things to talk about before we can talk about the work today. Number one, I've had a few questions about this. Like two, I think. You have body paragraphs due by the end of the week on turnitin.com. Some people were unsure about that because I hadn't mentioned it in a video. It's on the syllabus. So, like I always try to make it a point to remind you guys of homework that's coming up and things like that, right? But that's actually pretty atypical. What I mean by that is, especially going forward in your college careers, upper level classes, things like this, you will often encounter professors who take it for granted that you're comfortable with the syllabus and you know what's on it, and I mean that's like the outline of the class for you and for the teacher. So to put that another way, you should check the syllabus. Anyway, 2 body paragraphs due on Turnitin. It's by the end of the week, along with your last 2 bibs, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. We're going to talk a little bit about bibs. The bibs are on coursed in. One other bit of business I want to mention, your revisions are due next week. I know this is getting to the end of the semester. I know everybody, I mean, if you're anything like me, your hair's a little bit on fire. That's definitely how I feel. Totally normal to feel that way. The best thing I can tell you is take things one assignment at a time, one time suck of a time, right? Is kind of how it feels. And just kind of get stuff done when you can. Don't let yourself get overwhelmed as much as possible. And lastly, like I said, the semester's coming to a close, man. We're gonna get there. No matter what happens, it's a couple more weeks and then it's over with. So just make it work however you can. Okay, that's all the business out of the way in that regard. To begin with, again, before we jump into the bib, a little bit about, I had some people freaking out, and this always happens, about the final project. I think it's the terminology. When you guys, you do the same thing, I used to give quizzes, and a lot of students would just melt down over these quizzes. I think those quiz, project, that terminology, for some reason, it's kind of hardwired into your brains by the time you get to me, that these things are scary and the terms are dire and is high pressure. I'm not saying that can't be the case in some situations, but for us, I mean, especially if you've looked at the prompt for the final project, it's on coursed in, it's in its own section, it's called final project. It's not worth all that, I guess is how I would put it. There are 3 parts to it. And again, all this is spelled out on the prompt and the accompanying materials that are posted with the prompt. But I'm gonna break them down a little simpler, which is how I like to do it, right? The project is composed of 3 parts. You have an activity, a memo, and a video. Now, what do those parts look like? To begin with, and you have a template for all of this for the most part, you're gonna come up with some kind of an in-class activity we could do centered around your text. The way I would think of the project, it's almost like you're trying to sell me on the next time I teach this class. I don't think I'm teaching it next semester, but you know, pretend that I am. I always kind of revisit the text that I use, and I kind of think about like, well, should I change this? Should I update this? Blah, 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 right? You're trying to sell me on, here is not only why my text would fit into the conversation we're having in this class, right? But here's why my text would work in class. And here's an activity we could use, sort of like some of the activities we've done in class with Slaughterhouse-Five or with some of the poems, any of that, right? Or even some of the activities we're doing now online. I mean, it's a little bit different, but you get it. You plan out a little activity we could use to perform some analysis or build a body paragraph or think about a scene, anything like that. You're highlighting, again, how your text for the paper you're already writing, so you're already hopefully thinking about this text, how your text would fit into the larger conversation we're having in this class. Now, again, the good news about that is, ideally, you're already thinking about that stuff. If you're not at this point, you should. you should start right now. But I'm assuming all of you have already started that, the wheels kind of turning in your head. So now you're just sort of taking those thoughts and putting them into, I would argue, a less intense format, right? You're gonna come up with an in-class activity, and again, there's like guidelines, there's a template on Coursden for this stuff. You're gonna have a short little memo. It's 1 page, it's half a page, on like your process for the project, like how you went about coming up with what you did, planning it, whatever, right? And then a 5-minute, I believe on the prompt I call it an informal video. And we'll have instructions later on how to put that on Coursden. But again, you just record yourself sort of like I am now, talking to me, explaining to me really 2 things: how the activity works, okay? And then more importantly, again, how your text, given the activity, but just given the text itself, how your text fits into the larger conversations we've been having around masculinity, gender studies, this sort of societal expectations, the pressures that are put on people in certain situations, right? That's all you gotta do. It's not, I mean, if you're taking the paper seriously, and it seems like most of you are, I would hope by the end of all this, you would feel pretty able to do that, right? So it's not something that you shouldn't take seriously, this final project, but I don't want anyone to stress about it. It's honestly meant to be kind of, after you finished your paper, a bit of a victory lap is how I think of it. I mean, it is work, but it's not nearly, it's not the paper, right? The paper is I think most of you, if you haven't realized already, will in short order. The paper is the bulk of your work right now. The project is related, and it's meant to help you think about it a little bit more, maybe in a different way that can be helpful for some people. But that's it. It's not, some of you are sweating it. It's not worth that. Of course, if anybody has other questions about that, like I said, I will go over later sort of a few helpful tips for how to post the video to Coursden, because Coursden isn't super helpful all the time. But we're not going to worry about that right now. Okay, moving to the work for today. So I've gone ahead and I'm looking at my laptop over here in case anyone is curious why I keep staring off. I've gone ahead and posted the work to Coursden. The student bib example for today, we had one of your classmates decided they wanted to write about Ron Swanson. He's a character from what I consider to be an excellent show called Parks and Rec. It's a couple years old at this point. But Ron Swanson absolutely, in all kinds of ways, fits into, again, this larger conversation we've been having in class. So what I've posted for you is their bib, which we're going to talk about. Before you look at the bib, though, whether you're familiar with the show or not, I've posted a YouTube video I found of just like excellent Ron Swanson moments. I am not saying you have to watch the whole video. It's like a half-hour long, but I can think of worse ways to spend a half hour. But I would recommend everyone, even if you have seen the show, it's probably been a minute, I would recommend watch the first couple minutes. You know, you get a real feel for the kind of guy this guy is pretty quickly. But I would watch at least a couple minutes just so you know a little bit of what the student is alluding to in the bib. So your instructions, your first instructions here, go watch the first couple minutes of that video, then read over the bib, and then come back to the video. So pause it if you need to. I'm gonna give you a second. I'm assuming you paused. Okay, and you're back, right? Okay. So already it's pretty obvious, I would hope, in some ways, why this character does work probably really well for this paper. He's hyper masculine, right? In some of the ways we've talked about in class. I wouldn't say he's necessarily toxically masculine. I mean, he is probably in some regards, but he's not like the most toxically masculine characters we've encountered this semester. Lazaro from Slaughterhouse-5, Bobby Sudduth, right? He keeps coming up in some of the conversations I've had with you guys. Those characters are, they're hyper masculine in the way that Ron Swanson is, but it's like it takes a dark path that hyper masculinity, Ron Swanson is almost always like we laugh at him, right? It's comical. So I want to make that point first. It feels different from some of these other characters we've encountered thus far, right? And I think one sort of overarching argument you could begin to entertain is, why does this show want us laughing at this character? More often than not, when we're laughing, at least I think it's pretty funny, it's because he's just so damn ridiculous, right? And again, think about that word, ridiculous. We are ridiculing a lot of what this guy stands for. Now, one other point I want to make, and then we'll actually get to the bib. I don't think this show is out and out ridiculing everything this guy believes or everything he stands for. Like, it's not that simple. But the idea we keep coming back to in this class is, it seems like there are levels to these things, right? And it seems like the more extreme you get in any of these views, you invite ridicule, you invite the possibility for toxicity or what have you, right? But yeah, let's talk about the bib. I think that'll help center the conversation. The way I want to use this, because I like to use, as we've done all semester, student work to, obviously talk about what they have, but I want you to be able to use the conversation, or I guess deposition really, because I'm just talking at you, that what we're going to have about the student work, I want you to be able to apply that to your own, okay? So here's what I'm thinking. Alarm bells. We haven't talked about these in a little while, I don't think. I could be totally wrong about that. But in the same way we talk about them, that we have talked about them with texts this semester, right? You can apply the same thing to your own work, especially something like this. Like annotated bibs, they are note-taking tools. They are meant to help you organize information because you need to do that, right? But also, most of the time, in this case, with the bib I've pulled, it can also be generative. You guys, I keep telling you, are thinking on the page. Your thoughts aren't always great. My thoughts aren't always great. First go, okay? But when you're writing, and like when you're sitting down and actually writing, you are actually thinking, and that stuff is going to show up on the page. So I want to point out a couple things. Alarm bells that should be going off when we read this bib, which is my way of saying, for most of you, in some way, shape, or form, you're going to have similar stuff in your own work. You need to go hunting for that, because we're going to raise some questions here that this student really wants to think about when it comes to their paper, and they're not really doing it. Like, I'm worried that they're missing it in their bib, which signals to me they're probably going to miss it when it comes to their paper. Okay, so number one, I think it's the first paragraph. Yeah, in the first paragraph, the student tells us that they're talking to Nick Offerman, who's the actor who plays Ron Swanson, okay? And if you've ever seen Nick Offerman, he's kind of like a watered down version of Ron Swanson. Like, you really get the sense that he is just kind of that guy, which is fun, right? So he's a very fun guy to talk to and think about. And he's, apparently they're talking to him about scotch. And our student says, scotch or any dark liquor has been considered a very manly type of alcohol. They do rightly point out that Swanson is often drinking scotch over the course of the show. And then they say this: while a whole conversation could be made about the association with dark liquor and manly attributes, I decided to instead, and I'm like, why? What? Instead? What? You just said, you just said there's a whole conversation to be had. And I agree. I agree there is. Why aren't we entertaining that conversation? Like, the move they make, they're like, there's a lot to be said here, and I'm not gonna do it. What? What? Why? So to make it very quick, some of you may not be aware of this, by the way. I don't know what other people know. There is a weird association with masculinity and dark liquor in particular. I have thoughts on this, and And it can actually be summed up with another alarm bell in a way. Their second quotation, all the way at the end of the bib, Offerman says something about how he likes his whiskey like he likes his bacon, unadorned and straight up, or something like that. I'm using my memory a little bit. That's a similar idea to what we're talking about with this larger conversation around dark liquor. Like, first of all, you have to take those two things separately. And I understand at this point our conversation is getting ridiculous, and even that should highlight the ridiculous concerns we're talking about, right? Like, in other words, people take what we're about to talk about, some do, very seriously, which is kind of silly. For instance, people give a shit about, like, if you drink dark liquor or if you drink clear liquor. What is clear liquor, by the way? We're talking about vodka, we're talking about rum. It just struck me that I'm mostly talking to a bunch of 18-year-olds about alcohol a lot. Don't misunderstand this conversation. Anyway, but what are those when compared to whiskey or I don't want to display for you I have a lot of knowledge about this. Anyway, about dark liquors. What's the difference primarily between those? Well, one is much more bitter than the other. Dark liquor versus clear. Clear liquors primarily are used for mixing because they don't normally have much taste. They're more, I mean, they burn, they're alcohol, right? But you can mix them with things and they go down much easier. You make a cocktail, it's kind of nice. That brings me back to the Offerman quotation, unadorned. That's what he's saying. When you drink whiskey, or scotch in this case, which is kind of whiskey, there are mixers that exist because you mix anything with anything. But primarily those alcohols in particular, those liquors in particular, aren't considered mixers, right? They're more meant to be drunk on their own. So already when you say that you prefer dark liquor, you are saying what he says in that quotation, that you prefer the not mixed drink, right? What's the significance of that? What might that signal about that kind of person, especially in the arena we're talking about? You're sort of saying you don't want, I mean, it goes all the way back to the conversation we had about house shoes, right? Why do those connote femininity rather than masculinity? We're talking about comfort. So, sorry, I got a sneeze coming on and it won't come. It's killing me. A mixed drink tastes good, or at least tastes better than like a dark liquor, an unadorned dark liquor, right? But when you're saying you prefer that, you prefer the bitterness, you prefer it straight up, as he says. You're saying, no, I want to take the bitter, I want to take the harder thing, right? Why? The whole conversation our student is talking about that they completely fucking sidestep for some reason. You're announcing to the world with your drink order that you're this masculine man, right? And again, the conversation should start with, well, how are we doing that? It comes back to this lack of comfort, this lack of adornment. Hopefully most of you got to it in the clip. Again, it's only a couple minutes in. At one point, Ron Swanson is talking to these kids about the 3 acceptable haircuts, and he looks at this one kid and he says, "The scissors broken in your house," or whatever. And it's not. The kid's hair almost looks like mine, right? Like, it's a little longer. It's fine, right? Again, what's he saying? He's well, I'm going to segue to the first quotation here in a second, but it comes back to this lack of adornment, this lack of frills would be one way to think of it, right? And part of that is to do with comfort, is to do with like liquor tasting better, right? The other side of it ties into this first quotation, which is the first quotation in the bib. Again, I'm going to paraphrase. He's talking about how Swanson is like a paternal figure, which is pretty interesting. And he says, one thing he says a couple interesting things, but one of the most is, the choice is being made for us. Again, to bring it back to what we said a moment ago, you get 3 haircuts, he says. He has all these rules to live by, that he lives by. One of those rules is you only drink dark liquor, right? If you have all these rules that tell you how you should be, how you should live, how you should sort of portray yourself to the public, right, when you're out and about. We talked about that for most of the class as very limiting, and it is, right? It takes away your individuality, right? You can't like express yourself in the way that, you know, we talk about. And all that's true, and you kind of fit more of a stereotype. But it's interesting to think, like, almost nothing in this world is inherently negative completely, right? And Swanson says, well, rather, they are very close to each other. Offerman says that one of the things he thinks we like about Swanson as a character is for all his like overbearingness and sort of dictating to people what they should do and how they should think. We want someone maybe to limit our choices. I mean, because the best way I know to put it is like if for the third paper, and some of you experienced this a little bit, you know, I told you could write about pretty much anything. You could pick any text. And for some of you, that's really cool. You're like, oh, cool, I really like this movie, or I really like this show or this album that's gonna be really awesome to think about. Some of you ran with that. Some of you on the flip side were like, that's too much fucking choice. I don't know where to start, right? Same kind of thing, but now we're saying, well, apply that to your life, you know? Someone's gonna say, you can dress however you want, you can do whatever you want. You wake up in the morning, you're like, I don't know what to do. I would like some limitations. I would like some rules. And we do have them as a society. Like you have to wear pants or something, right? Like we have a few. My point is, Offerman is doing 2 things here, which is very interesting. And our student, to their credit, highlights them a little bit, but I would like them to dig further into it. So for one, the choice is being made for us. Offerman basically says the kind of guy Swanson is, all the ways that he's funny to us, like, and it does, I think, ridicule this kind of masculinity, and it really wants to show us how over the top it is, how untenable it is. All that's true, okay, and worth thinking about. But at the same time, Offerman makes the point, we kind of find those limitations attractive too. And I think that's interesting because I'll put it this way, I forget how long, I think Parks and Rec is like 8 seasons, something like that. You do, at least I never did, you don't get tired of this character, and you would if he was just limiting and terrible for 8 years. Like, that shit gets old, right? He's saying part of it is we do have some kind of a positive association with those limiting factors. This comes back to, I'm almost done. I know I promised you guys no longer than 20, 30 minutes. I'm gonna wrap it up, but I wanna give you a big picture sort of send off here. A couple points in this semester, late in this semester, I tried to have the conversation with you guys because it's a weird one, and I'm not sure what to do with it, but a lot of these texts in different ways present the idea that we have stereotypes. And here in 2020, I mean, just knowing what little bit I know of the world you guys encounter when you go onto social media or you're in high school and they're telling you different things, we understand that stereotypes are bad. Again, they're limiting, right? We talked about this in Fairchild, we talked about this all the time, and they are. But to hear Offerman tell it comes back to the question I raised, which is, well, if we all know they're bad, why do we still have them? Right? Like, we all, I mean, apart from like, you know, fucking racist uncles and stuff like that, but like, apart from those people, we all agree, like, yeah, these are terrible, we should fucking get rid of these. But we still have them. Like, we all still walk around with them, right? Now, why is that? Part of that is social conditioning, and that's a thing. But another part of it is what Offerman is getting at, which is they're attractive. It helps us navigate the world, not just in terms of how we view other people, which again is oftentimes awful, but it helps us navigate it for ourselves too. Like if we know the kinds of rules that Ron Swanson is getting at, we know, sort of based upon the situation, how we should act or interpret others, how we should shape our own behavior as a result, right? It's almost like he's saying the limitations, to quote him, the choices being made for us help us make sense of the world, right? Because if we had none of those, it would almost feel like your life would almost feel like some of you feel when it comes to making this paper, right? For those of you out there that are still like, I'm just so freaking out because I don't know how to approach this because I'm being given too much choice, right? Well, he's saying, well, apply that to your life, right? Like all of a sudden I can weirdly see the attraction a little bit in terms of like why we as a society have these super antiquated, super limiting sets of rules and expectations. So it's odd. It's worth thinking about, and it's also worth researching some more. See if you can find other things on sort of, and I'm not going to put it correctly. This is going to sound bad, but I'm like the positive attributes of stereotypes, or like a positive spin on why we have stereotypical expectations when it comes to social structure or something like that. Do you know what I'm saying? It's worth looking into. Lastly, and then we're done, okay? The other thing that Swanson does, or Offerman, the other thing that Offerman does in the first quotation is he lumps all of that, and it's kind of a longish quotation. I wouldn't want to see all of that just in one spot in the paper. That's too big. But one other thing he does is he calls Swanson a paternal figure, which is interesting. Is this what fatherhood is? Like, I mean, for me, I'm a dad. I have 2 small boys, and as I'm fond of telling you guys a lot, we're a fairly progressive household, my wife and I. But for as progressive as we are, we do sometimes, not intentionally, fall into these sort of gendered roles. Primarily for me, like I am the authority figure. Like that's just how it just happened, right? We never really we never decided like you will be bad cop, you know, but it just happened that way. So is that the sort of choices being made for us, the limitations we're talking about, is that like a fundamental in our society part of the definition of fatherhood? Is Ron Swanson, as Nick Offerman would tell it, is he a father figure in the show? You may not be able to suss that out just based on that video, by the way. But it's a weird thing to think about, right? And are we basically saying, like if you buy that first quotation from Offerman, to put it another way, he's basically saying that these limiting factors we have in society, these rules for behavior and like how you should dress or what people expect of you, I don't think he's saying all of those are positive. There's absolutely some that are worse than others that we could probably get rid of and be fine, right? But what he's saying is some of them, maybe even a lot of them, are helpful in the same way that, you know, having your dad set a bedtime or waking you up I always wake my boys up at 6:30 if they're not up yet, you know. Having that structure that we weirdly code, not just masculine, but paternal, which is even more specific, having those rules, it's almost like necessary for society for some reason, right? That's weird and really interesting. And we kind of don't talk about it much. We gesture toward that one, so I think it is kicking around in that student's head. But I'd like it to kick around a little more. I'd like to hear a little more, right? All right. Last thought, and then we're done. When it comes to applying any of this to your work, because every semester I get students who are like, why do we keep talking about other people? It's like, well, because we can't talk about everyone. That's bananas. And you should, hopefully, be able to talk, be able to take thoughts about another text and apply it to your own, like that. Anyway, I want you guys, first of all, going back and looking for alarm bells in your primary texts, in your secondary sources if you like, but also in your own work. So often, you guys, I think the biggest hurdle most of you have to get over is, and it's a hard one, but you don't realize that I'm not in your head. I truly believe most of you, I'm not gonna say everyone, right? I'm not gonna generalize, but I think most of you have really good thoughts, even if they're germinal at this stage, fancy word, look it up. But I think all of you have real thoughts about your texts, but they're not on the page. I think in this bib, in some places, our student author here has some ideas about Ron Swanson that they're maybe gonna talk about in their paper, but they're not really developed much at all in the bib. Maybe they would be in the paper. We don't know yet. But what I'm saying is you got to start that now. Go back and look at your work, what you have thus far. Look for alarm bells. Look for possibilities. Those don't always pan out, but sometimes they do. And sometimes it's really cool shit. Like stereotypes are a father figure for our society in some way, right? Or something. I'm not saying that the student would agree with that or find hard evidence for that in the show, but that Offerman is telling us that's a part of the conversation. So it's worth thinking about. It's worth going and looking for, right? Not least of which, Ron Swanson becomes a dad in the show, and it softens him, which is weird, right? He's not nearly as limiting once he actually becomes a father. That would seem to, in one way, contradict what Offerman is saying. Or does it not? Might we be thinking about it in the wrong way? These are important questions that we don't really talk about in the bib. All right. Oh, and because people ask me questions sometimes. Yeah, this is my son's playset. It's a big, stupid. The whole house is filled with toys. They live a magical existence, and I just float around it as best I can. Anyway, hope you all are well. We're getting on here. We are all sick. Doesn't feel good in 2020. But, you know, we'll see what happens. Like I said, hope everybody's doing all right. Keep hitting me up as you need to. Some of you are really good about that. And, yeah, we'll just keep it going. Thanks, guys.